Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Maya McGinnis. I'm the Director of the Fiscal Policy Program at the New America Foundation, as well as the President for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. On behalf of myself and Adam Carasso from the New America Foundation, thank you for joining us today on our conference, Patch It or Pitch It, Reforming the AMT. And thank you so much to our guests for showing up, because it's a snow day here in Washington, and of course, as delighted as I was to be woken up at 5 a.m. this morning by my son who wanted to go make snow angels, snow is not the friend of somebody who's hosting a conference, so I'm glad you're all able to navigate the weather and make it here on time. We have an all-star lineup today of folks to discuss the alternative minimum tax and potential approaches to reforming the tax. We're going to first hear from two members of Congress, Paul Ryan, ranking member of the Budget Committee, and Steny Hoyer, House Majority Leader. I'd like to say just a couple words about each of them. Paul Ryan is somebody who, if none of you have worked with him, or for those of you who have not, the risk is you walk into his office to talk to him about an issue, and he almost definitely will know more than anybody who's in there to pitch him on something or discuss something. So I have been incredibly impressed with the level of detail and their commitment to fiscal policy as well. Both of the speakers who we have joining us this morning, while coming from incredibly different perspectives, both have been doing really much of the heavy lifting in their respective parties for focusing on the challenges of long-term fiscal issues in the country. And that's incredibly important on moving away from the short term onto the long term. And secondly, but I was just singing your praises, so thank you for walking in. I'm saying the good things.
I got here in time.
That's right.
You've been later, it's been a longer introduction.
And House Majority Leader Hoyer, of course, has had an incredible workload recently, moving forward with the AMT, navigating the huge negotiation that is going on in Congress between the House, the Senate, Republicans, Democrats, Congress, the White House, so many moving pieces. And one of the things that he has stuck to, which I think is critically important, is finding a way that this legislation will be offset so that hopefully it will have as little negative fiscal impact as possible. And then one of the things I also just want to say about Congressman Ryan that I think is so useful is what I think he'll talk about today is a tax plan alternative that he's put forward, and I've really been impressed with his courage in putting forth specific. I can't even say that word, specific. So, so often when people disagree with things that are going on the Hill, they are quick to criticize and not so quick to put forth alternatives, and Congressman Ryan has done just that. So I'm really looking forward to hearing both of these speakers. They will be with us for as long as their schedules permit, which is not too long. I have to make sure you get out on time. And then we'll hear from a panel of experts. So thank you so much for joining us today. Congressman Hoyer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. My timing was pretty good, I guess.
Yes.
Paul, of course, was here early. Let me, you mentioned about Paul. One of my opponents many years ago was asked by the press, you know, people say that Steny Hoyer is very effective and works very hard. And my opponent's response was, yes. The bad news is he's very effective at doing the wrong things. Paul, I'm glad to hear you have a tax policy. You're going to hear two different points of view here. I think there will be commonality in the point of view. The commonality in the point of view will be that Paul and I both believe there's a problem that needs to be resolved. And we need to return to some degree of fiscal responsibility. His perspective and mine differ as to how one gets there and the ramifications of how one gets there. In any event, I am very, very pleased to be with this group. I'm particularly pleased to be with so many young people because I think the ramifications of the policies that we're discussing are going to be most impacting you, not me. Paul Ryan, you'll enjoy the story. When he was first elected to Congress of the United States, I was in an elevator along with Congressman Ryan got in. And I hadn't really met Congressman Ryan. I think I've probably seen his picture in one of the books of people we were trying to beat.
You campaigned against him.
I'm sure I did. And he came into the elevator, and I sort of looked at him. I didn't say anything, but I sort of looked at him like, who is this young fellow here? And he looked back at me, and he said, I'm Paul Ryan, I'm a member. And he is an excellent member. He is a bright, hardworking, honest, member of the Congress of the United States. But we differ in very significant ways on how we get from where we are to where we both want to be, and that is a fiscally responsible management of the federal government. Maya, thank you very much for your leadership. You have been an outspoken advocate, I think, of getting us to fiscal responsibility. Is Bill Frenzel here? Where's Bill? There, he just came in. Let me say to those of you who may not have known Congressman Frenzel during the time in his service, long and distinguished service in the House of Representatives. He and I served on the House Administration Committee together, so we got to be good friends in that context. But as you will find out if he speaks a little later, one of the most responsible members of the Congress of the United States who viewed issues not in a partisan framework but in a policy framework. And we were all advantaged, our country was advantaged by his service. So I thank him for being here. Let me state the obvious. Without question, the alternative minimum tax is not working as it was originally intended. I understand the focus of this discussion is the alternative minimum tax. I was quoted in the paper today as saying that not paying to fix the alternative minimum tax was not only an intellectually bankrupt policy, it was an immoral policy. Pretty tough statement. Paul will disagree with me on that. Essentially, the President of the United States disagrees with me on that. Their contention, as stated by one of their members, was the AMT was never expected to impact the people it's impacting now. It was a mistake, and therefore we need to fix it, and because it was a mistake, we don't need to pay for it. When I drive my car through a stop sign and somebody hits me broadside, it was a mistake. Somebody's going to pay for it. If we don't pay for the AMT, let me tell you who's going to pay for it. All of you young people are going to pay for it. The AMT designed to ensure that about 150 wealthy families, a very long time ago, paid their fair share in federal income taxes when it was enacted in 1969, before many of you were born, before Paul was born. Today threatens to, that's correct, today threatens to ensnare, as you can tell, I like Paul Ryan. I think Paul Ryan's a good member. Paul Ryan's going to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. He and I disagree on what that is, but he and I can sit down together because I respect him as an intellectually honest person and a very bright person to do that. We enacted this to, as I say, in fact, about 150 very wealthy families who, through utilization of tax preference items, avoided paying any contribution towards their tax system. Well, let me make an observation. The wealthier you are in America, the more benefit you get from the federal government. If someone would say, what do you mean by that? A welfare recipient, Medicaid recipient who gets this money. Very frankly, the more you have in America, the more you need the police force, the fire department, good roads to get your goods to and from, the more you need a national defense system that keeps your country secure, that keeps the shipping lanes open. Now, do we all need that, the rich and the poor alike? Of course that's the case. But the greater the amount of our assets, the greater benefit we have for a stable environment, both internationally and domestically. The bottom line is that we need a solution to the AMT, not finger pointing. As all of you know, the House passed legislation on November 9th to prevent the AMT from unfairly reaching into the pockets of middle-income families. I think that bill was possibly one of the best tax bills that I have voted for in terms of its populist impact on cutting the taxes of millions and millions and millions of people. Let me assure you, the Democratic majorities in Congress have every intention of enacting an AMT patch this year. The House bill offered by Chairman Charlie Rangel is, as I said, a good bill. In addition to protecting 23 million taxpayers from being hit with the AMT, this bill would, and I provide 30 million homeowners, 30 million with property tax relief. Help 12 million children by expanding the child tax rate. Help 4.5 million families better afford college with tuition tax deduction, save 3.4 million teachers money with a deduction for classroom expenses, and extend tax credits and deductions that will benefit a wide array of Americans and the American economy. Furthermore, this legislation helps to restore tax fairness and demonstrates the House majority's commitment to fiscal responsibility. Republicans, who claim that they are fiscally responsible, nonetheless complain that we pay for this legislation by closing what we refer to as tax loopholes. Now, I understand that one man's tax loophole is another man's tax benefit or tax incentive or tax entitlement. Their solution, just add the cost of the A&T fix, about $50 billion, to the deficit and national debt. Now, that is not just some esoteric number that floats off in the air. It is, young people, what you will have to pay with interest at some time in the future. We're paying over $250 billion this year, more than we're spending on the discretionary spending on education, healthcare, basic biomedical research, community health centers, etc., in the labor health bill. I absolutely reject fiscally irresponsible approach of fixing the AMT. That is, making sure that a large number of people do not get a tax increase. Approximately 80% of them are over $200,000 in income, and expecting our children and grandchildren to pay the freight and the interest. I've said many times I will not vote for an alternative minimum tax bill that is not paid for, even if I'm the only House member to do so. That will not be popular. It will be demagogued by many that you let people get this huge tax increase. And what's the difference? The difference is the people who are going to get the huge tax increase, if we don't pay for it, don't vote. We don't have a lobby group, except perhaps this group, the Concord Coalition, and some other groups. We simply cannot keep pulling out the national credit card and charging our bills to the national debt, thus forcing our children and grandchildren to pay for this generation's purchases. Yet over the last 7 years, that is precisely what we've done in the Bush administration. It's simply irresponsible and would require us to borrow even more money from foreign investors to pay our bills. This administration, under the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate, has borrowed more money from foreign governments than all of the other administrations combined. You've heard about how many dollars China has, Russia has, except part of that, of course, in Russia, the oil prices. But in terms of borrowing money, we have gone from a creditor nation to a debtor nation. Simply irresponsible. This is why Democrats reinstated PAYGO as one of our first acts. And PAYGO, in fact, has helped make us tough decisions with respect to spending priorities. By the way, that deal was made in a bipartisan fashion, essentially led by Dick Gephardt of my party and George Bush the first of the Republican Party. Now, George Bush paid a price for that because he had said, read my lips, no new taxes. Dick Darman, the director of OMB, said, Mr. President, we're going deeper and deeper into debt, and debt matters. Frankly, the Republicans over the last 6 years have said debt does not matter. And they've taken us over $1 trillion into debt, almost $1.6 trillion into debt in the last 80 months. As Congressman Ryan's heard, because they offered the budget, young people, I've served in the Congress almost as old as Paul Ryan is, not quite, for 26 years, 27 years. He was very young. And I want you to get this fact. 19 of those guys, because I know some of you have the perception that somehow the Republican Party is the party of fiscal responsibility. That was dissipated pretty severely, and they're very concerned about that and trying to reclaim that mantle by doing some things I think are not appropriate. But having said that, for 19 straight years under Republican presidents, we ran deficits in the $100 billion plus category. without exception. The only person in the United States, it is my contention, that can stop spending is the President of the United States. Paul Ryan can't stop spending. I can't stop spending. Steny Hoyer and 217 other people, and 51 people in the Senate or 60 people in the Senate, the way they operate, can stop spending. But the only one person that can stop spending is the President of the United States. Why do I say that? I've been here 26 plus years. Never once in my 26 years has a President of the United States had a veto overridden because a bill was vetoed for spending too much. Not once in 26 years has that happened. I don't know whether it's happened historically ever, perhaps it has, but it hasn't happened since I've been in the Congress of the United States. Which means, had Ronald Reagan, George Bush the first, or this President Bush said no to spending, it would have stopped. The President didn't veto one bill in the first 4, 5 years, 6 years of his term that dealt with spending. The only bill he vetoed was the stem cell bill during the 6 years. Which was not about spending, it was about policy. What that means is, when we went $1.6 trillion in debt, we did it because of the policies pursued or allowed to go proceed under Republican leadership in the House, Senate, and in the Congress. Why? Because there is a very substantial philosophical policy difference between the Republican argument and the Democratic argument. The Democratic argument is we ought to pay for things. George Bush agreed with that. In 1997, in a bipartisan way, we reiterated that commitment. However, in 2001, 2002, and 2003, in the budgets that were submitted, pay-go had its cap, had doffed to it, but not pursued, and in 2004, it was dropped altogether from Republican budgets. In the House, we've insisted that our bills be paid for by closing tax loopholes and insisting that people pay their fair share. In fact, the pay-fors that we've included in our bills have been approximately 80% spending cuts and 20% tax increases. As it relates to no one source of the suggested pay-fors, Harvard economist Greg Mankiw, the former chair of the Council on Economic Advisors under President Bush, has written that, and I quote, as we talk about carried interest as one of our pay-fors in the AMT, carried interest earned by venture capitalists and private equity professionals should be taxed the same as other compensation for services, not capital gains. That is not a Republican, that's not a Democrat, that was a Republican economic advisor to this president. So in the days ahead, I have every intention of insisting that our AMT patch be paid for. Speaker Pelosi has expressed her strong commitment to fiscally neutral bills as well. And I know that Congressman Ryan and many of his Republican colleagues have argued that we shouldn't have to pay for the AMT because a patch simply prevents us from collecting revenues that we never intended to collect in the first place. He is absolutely accurate in the contention that it was never intended. That there is no dispute on it. But I go back to my argument that going through the stop line, the stop sign, and having an accident was not intended. But notwithstanding the lack of intention, there is a consequential cost. And that consequential cost can either be paid for by those who made the mistake, or I can ask my children and grandchildren to pay for it at some time in the future. The fact is, the President's budget has consistently called for a revenue-neutral AMT fix. Interesting. Furthermore, the then Republican Congress and the administration relied on the increased AMT revenues to offset part of the 2001 tax cuts, so that it was anticipated that AMT would have revenues and relied upon, which is why it's an annual fix. I am for a permanent fix that is paid for. I think that would be the responsible thing to do. Why? It costs about $50 billion a year to fix the AMT, which we've done repeatedly, which simply adds $50 billion of additional debt to future generations. It is simply intellectually and fiscally dishonest, in my opinion, to use the increased revenues from AMT to make the tax cuts appear more affordable and rely on those revenues to show a path to balance the budget. But then claim we don't need to pay for legislation reducing those revenues because they weren't sponsored collect them. Supposed to collect them. Now let me say, when I say it's dishonest, both parties have done that. This is not just simply, now why do we do it? So we can compare apples to apples on our budgets. Obviously, we would be much more hard-pressed to show an apples-to-apples comparison with our budget if we said that Republican budget revenue assumptions are wrong and we will not take them, or we will fund the war, not out of emergency, but out of the budget, because then the comparison would be a comparison which would be very hard for people to understand. We're going to reduce the revenues from the AMT, as I think we should, that were assumed in the plans to balance the budget in 2012. We need to either replace those revenues. After all, we have relied on them to protect our budgets. So that if we reduce them, those projections were, by definition, incorrect. We need to either pay for them, we need to either replace those revenues or reduce spending if we're serious about balancing the budget. Now, very frankly, had the Republicans reduced taxes substantially and then reduced spending commensurately, I think that would have been an honest presentation. I think that's what Paul Ryan wants to do. And I think that's the intellectually honest. That's why I respect Paul. And not only do I respect him, I like him. We disagree, as you will hear in just a minute, pretty significantly. But he is honest in how he wants to get there. However, in my opinion, the Republican policies that have pursued have not been. And you young people, they have cut taxes for your parents and increased your taxes later on for what they are buying today. Finally, let me say that I agree with those who argue that mitigating the effect of the AMT every year through a patch is not good policy. I said I was for a permanent fix. That is why I generally support Charlie Rangel's bill, which is a permanent fix. Is it easy to fix it permanently? It is not. It takes zero courage. Zero courage. I've been in a legislative office almost 40 years. I served in the state senate for 12. I'm here now almost 27. It takes zero courage to cut taxes. Everybody loves you when you cut their taxes. What takes courage is to cut spending or to pay for what you buy. That's what takes courage. The Senate, of course, has now retreated from any discussions. Now they're going to discuss it with us on the fix of the AMT or the Medicare, the doctor fix, which needs to be done. In closing, I'd like to observe that comprehensive revision of our tax structure is long overdue. I think Paul Ryan can be part of that solution. I obviously hope a Democrat is elected president. He hopes a Republican is elected president. Whoever is elected president, I'm hopeful, because it is absolutely essential. There will be no major tax reform without the engagement of an energetic focus from the President of the United States. It can't happen. The Congress cannot do it alone. If the AMT is not addressed this year or next in a comprehensive way, then modification of the AMT must be accomplished in a larger tax reform package that should be a priority of the next administration and the next Congress. Again, I want to thank all of you who are here. I want to particularly thank Maya and her organization. Bill, I want to thank you for, as a member, and then keeping the faith for every year since you left the Congress of the United States and focusing on this extraordinarily important public policy issue for generations yet to come. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. No, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. There are two encouraging things I do take from both his presentation and the one we're about to hear. One, it is wonderful to see members and important members in both parties actually kind of competing to be the fiscally responsible party, and I think we are shifting in that direction. Two, I think that we are on the cusp of moving towards something this country desperately needs, which is fundamental tax reform. And the AMT really presents a very interesting lens into both of these issues. So I'd like to turn it over to Congressman Ryan for his comments.
That way I can talk.
I'm going to leave, but will all of you report to me what
you can tell we have mutual respect, but I don't think you like my schedule too much, Sandy. I got constituents in my office for a 10:30 meeting.
Sorry about that.
But I'm just kidding. My favorite kind of people in Washington politics are people who are passionate about their beliefs and who fight for their philosophy consistently. That's why Steny Hoyer is one of my favorite people. I'm not talking Republicans or Democrats. Steny Hoyer is a man of conviction. He's a guy who knows how to apply his philosophy, and he does so consistently. And that's why you see the two of us liking each other so much, because he is a man who earns and deserves our respect, and he has mine for sure. He is a very worthy adversary. Let me give you the other side of the story, or another perspective, and I'll try to do this fairly quickly because I've got some folks waiting in my office. What is this tax? And Steny mentioned this. This is a tax that was passed before I was born, back in 1969, to get 155 multimillionaires to make sure they paid some tax because they were using all these different loopholes and deductions legally to avoid taxation. That sounds fine, no problem. Wise idea. You know, we can close those loopholes in subsequent tax reforms, 86 probably the biggest of them all. But where are we now? This thing, the AMT, is now swallowing up the middle class. It's going to hit 23 million people if we don't get this patch done. It's going to hit about 35 million people by the end of the decade. This tax was never intended to do this. It was never meant to be. And so my point, contrary to Steny's, is two wrongs don't make a right. Just because this thing was never meant to be doesn't mean we have to all of a sudden replace it with some other big tax. Now here's the point and the basic premise between our two beliefs and philosophies. What the AMT does, because it's such an effective revenue machine, is it takes our government at unprecedented levels. Our government, the federal government, has taxed our economy really remarkably in a consistent way at about 18.3% of GDP. Now, why does this matter? How much the government takes out of the economy, how much the government takes out of entrepreneurs, out of families, out of businesses, out of economic growth and productivity matters. It matters to our personal freedoms, it matters to economic growth, it matters to our standard of living. All you have to do is look around the globe and see what bigger governments can do to their people. You can see the plague of high unemployment rates. You can see the stagnation that occurs in countries in Europe that have gone down this path of large chunks of GDP being taken out of the economy and going to the federal government. So this matters. It matters to our standard of living, it matters to our economic growth, and I would argue it matters more now than ever given that we are really in the era of globalization. We can't take for granted our economic prowess anymore. Oceans don't separate our economies now with broadband and technology. So we have to keep an eye on the ball of being competitive internationally. That means we have to care how big our government gets. We have to care how much of GDP we take out of production, take out of the economy. Now, does every bit of money taken out of the economy harm the economy? No, of course not. But you can get to this point, and it's so clear statistically that great nations keep their governments lean and let their people keep more of what they earn. Let their businesses get better return on their investments, on their ingenuity, on their innovations, on their risk-taking. We in this country put a premium on risk-taking, entrepreneurship, success, and hard work. We want to continue to do that. Here's what the AMT does. The AMT takes us next decade to 21% of GDP. Then after that, it takes us up to 24% of GDP. And it's chasing an ever higher line of spending, which is the entitlements. And this is interwoven with our entitlement problem. And that's the point I want to make, which is we believe we should keep our government roughly where it is today. We shouldn't buy into this notion of the baseline, the CBO baseline, whichever baseline you want to point to, that says because this law is in place, it is all right and all good that we're going to have this ever higher and growing federal government. That we're going to go from our historic level of 18.3% of GDP up to 21 and up to 24. Because if we just buy into that, if we think that that's fine and good and okay, and we have to replace this tax with some other tax, then we are putting us on a path of stagnation. We are putting us on a path of not being internationally competitive. And what I would argue is we're putting us on a path of lulling us to not facing up to our real fiscal issues, and that's entitlements. And that's the other point I want to make, which is if we say, let's just replace this revenue with some other tax increase. That's basically what the Mother Bill does. Charlie is another man who I have tremendous respect for. Charlie Rangel is one of the smartest guys in this institution. I think he has been in Congress longer than I've been living. And Charlie is being intellectually honest with his premise, just as Steny is. But what you have to do to replace this revenue, if we all agree the AMT is a bad bill, you have to really suck it to taxpayers. The top marginal tax rate, the tax rate on small businesses, is 44.2% under the mother bill. That means where about 70% of our jobs come from, small businesses. 75% of the revenue from the top rate comes from small businesses, sub-chapter S corporations, partnerships. That means we're going to tax them at 44.2%, up from 35. It's kind of funny that in the mother bill they lower the corporate rate because of international competitiveness to 30.5, but they raise the tax rate on small businesses to 44.2. That is not how you win globalization. That is not how you create jobs and economic growth in this country. But that is what you have to do in order to buy this notion that the AMT itself is maybe a bad tax, but we want all that money into the government. We reject that premise, that notion. We don't want all this money into the government. We want it into the private sector, into the hands of entrepreneurs and families and businesses. So that is the premise of this argument. But what I want to make the point is, and this is what I think what you've done such a good job on, Maya, is let's make sure we keep us where we are. And I have a plan that does that, and I'll describe that in a moment. But let's make sure then we don't lull ourselves into not addressing these entitlements. So if we buy this notion that we're going to accept this baseline, which will actually bring us in, according to the budget projections, into a budget surplus before too long, you think Congress is going to have the attitude to cutting spending? You think if we're going to see all this new money coming in on paper, we're going to really take a hard look at our entitlement programs and our spending programs? No. We're going to delay it. We're not going to take it on. And then we're going to find ourselves 10 years later with a lot of baby boomers already in retirement, and it may be too late to fix these problems. See, my concern is we have about 10 years in this country to fix our entitlement problem. I see a lot of people in my generation here. I'm in the X generation. And the problem with the X generation and subsequent generations, take my 3 kids. My daughter Liza's 5, my son Charlie's 4, my son Sam is 3. When my kids are exactly my age, just to keep today's government going, no new programs, no fewer programs, but to keep today's government going, they're going to have to pay twice the amount of taxes we pay today to keep it afloat. We're going to have to go from about 18.5% of GDP to 40% of GDP just to keep the government going at that time, today's federal government. You cannot be a great nation with that level of taxation. You cannot maintain a high standard of living. So what we are on the precipice of doing is severing this great legacy of America. And my grandparents and parents told me the legacy of this country is that one generation leaves the next generation better off. That it is your job to be good stewards of this country so that your kids and your grandkids can have a better chance at the American dream, can have a higher standard of living. We will sever that legacy if we buy into this notion that this baseline is the right thing to do. We will sever that legacy if we buy into this notion that we're going to go up to 24 and 40% of GDP. So I say we put a stake in the ground right now, and we have this debate now. We have this debate on tax policy, we have this debate on levels of taxation, and we have this debate on entitlements. January 1st is the first day baby boomers begin retiring. 2008 is when they start. If we lull ourselves by buying into this baseline and having all this new money come into the federal government, money that was never intended to come in the first place, we will not face up to our entitlement programs. And we will wait 10 years and we'll have millions of baby boomers into these programs, and it will probably be too late to fix these programs. Because in 10 years, the lines cross and these programs go insolvent. See, that's why I think it's all so important to maintain our economic growth, our standard of living, and to face up to the true fiscal challenge of this generation, and that is the entitlements. The sooner we act on our entitlements, the more compassionate our reforms will be, the more rational our reforms will be, the better our reforms will be. The longer we procrastinate, the uglier it gets. And that is what you're getting if you buy into this baseline and you bring all this new money into the federal government. So the real tough thing to do is to face up to our entitlements now and come up with real plans to fix it. The irresponsible thing to do is to bring all this new money into the federal government, lull us into complacency, think that our balance sheet is okay, and not do anything about our real fiscal challenge in this country. So what I have proposed, and I'm really a believer, if you're going to criticize, you better put up or shut up. So I propose an alternative. I propose an alternative to the Rangel bill, which says let's keep our government at its that's path right now at about 18.5% of GDP. Revenue neutral based on what we bring in today. And let's give taxpayers a choice. They can have this 1040 code with all its loopholes and deductions, all its different rates, or they can choose, the taxpayer, him or herself can choose to have an alternative code. It's kind of like the AMT, but in reverse. The AMT, you got to fill out both forms, and you have to pay the higher of the two. Under the Taxpayer Choice Act, you can choose which form you want. And under the Taxpayer Choice Act, you have a 10% bracket up to $100,000, 25% tax rate above that, and you have generous personal and standard exemptions. Family of four earning $39,000 will not pay income taxes. A $12,500 standard exemption, you have $25,000 joint, $3,500 for personal exemptions. You can, and no other deductions or loopholes. This is my 8th or 9th year on the Ways and Means Committee, and I'll basically finish with this. And it has come to I just believe that the tax expenditure lobby in this town is so powerful and so great that there are so many people that are coming to us, making sure we don't get rid of their pet deduction or their loophole, and they pick members of Congress off like flies. And so that is why I believe the Taxpayer Choice Act regime is the way to go, so that we, members of Congress, can simply say to this taxpayer lobby, which is very effective, and it has a lot of worthiness to it, look, I'm letting my taxpayer, my constituent decide. If they want your deduction, they can have it. If they want to have a simpler system, they can choose that too. And I believe that is how you keep economic growth in this country. That is a pro-growth policy that will keep our competitive edge, because backstopping all of this is the fact that we have competition from China, from India, from all different places, and we need to keep lean, and we need to have a tax code that rewards competition, that brings capital into America and doesn't push it abroad. So to me, that is the way this issue lines up. That's the philosophical differences between us, and I'm really hoping my constituents aren't too mad at me for being 15 minutes late. I'd love to stay and take questions, but I just don't think I have the time to do that. I want to give you basically our take on it. I think this is creating a perfect storm for tax reform, and that's the upside in all of this. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Ryan. I'm going to ask the second panel to come up and get seated, and I am shortly going to turn over the moderating job to David Wessel of the Wall Street Journal. While everyone's getting seated, I'm just going to make a few remarks. We have a very diverse panel who's going to be speaking about AMT reform, and we've really kept the topic wide open so that they're invited to speak about anything they wish. There's just one comment I'm going to throw out there because I can't ignore it, and it's sort of part of my nature. I always find myself kind of outside of conventional wisdom and looking in. And I must be the only person who thinks this, because it's quite remarkable that right now AMT reform is about one of the only topics on Capitol Hill that is clearly something that both parties agree is a must do. I am not yet convinced that AMT reform should be the top priority in the country, and that's for two reasons. One, it is immensely expensive, and if you're talking about a $50 billion cost for this year alone, there are other tax reforms that would be better for the economy, that we could use that money to do, and there are other tax reforms that would be fairer for people. In a world of growing income inequality, one wanted to target tax cuts. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the AMT is still not a tax increase that is hitting the people who probably are most vulnerable right now. So that's just kind of some inflammatory softballs or hardballs to throw into the group to see if anybody's interested in commenting on that. The other point I would make is that the AMT in some ways actually serves as a trigger right now, because we do have AMT creep, and it is something that both parties feel so is necessary to address. They don't want the unsuspecting families to be hit with such a large tax increase. It will help push us towards more fundamental reform, meaning including all of tax policy, including entitlements and a bigger budget deal. Congress doesn't always work that way. It tends to move in incremental steps, but a comprehensive look at these issues is clearly what's in order. So I kind of like having the pressure of the AMT there pushing us to the table to really negotiate a big deal. I really look forward to hearing the panel, and particularly why I'm wrong on my thoughts about it, and I'm going to turn it over to David Wessel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. So nobody should have to stand for a conversation about the AMT. So there's a seat there, there's a seat here, there's a few here. I'm sure if anybody wants to sit up there, it's fine. And if you sit up there, you have to vote on whether we have AMT. I'm Dave Wessel from the Wall Street Journal. I'm pleased to be here. One of the reasons they have reporters moderate these things is to keep the speakers to their allotted time period. So you can see nobody on this panel is a member of Congress, even Bill Frenzel anymore. So you're only going to get the 5 minutes that we've allotted. Each of the panelists is going to speak for 5 minutes. Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we can open it up to people from the floor. We're not going to go in alphabetical order. I've asked Len Berman to start first. Len is an economist who's now the director of the Tax Policy Center, which is a joint venture of Urban Institute and Brookings, and has worked in the Treasury's tax policy shop in the Clinton administration. And I asked Len to start because the Tax Policy Center tries to frame issues in ways that ordinary people can understand. After that, we're going to hear from Robert Carroll, who has this job at Treasury that Len had in the Clinton administration. He's also an economist and will defend absolutely everything that the Bush administration has said and done on tax policy, I'm sure. Following that, we're going to hear from Aviva Arandine, who's a policy analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which is very active in these issues, and Alex Brill, who has worked both for the Committee on Ways and Means, for former Chairman Bill Thomas, and for the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors under Glenn Hubbard in the current Bush administration. And finally, I'm going to ask Bill Frenzel, Bill, we were wondering, did you vote for the AMT?
No.
No, I didn't think so. I agree with everything that Steny Hoyer and Maya has said, that in the years of covering the budget, there are a few people who are as constant in their views and as helpful to the press in understanding them as Congressman Frenzel. So I was tempted to turn this into some kind of Alcoholics Anonymous thing and start by saying, hi, I'm David, I pay the AMT. So I'm not going to ask every panelist to make that confession. And so let me start with Len, and I'll try and keep everybody to the 5 minutes. Thank you. Apparently only this mic and this mic work. So you guys have to share the mic.
Thank you, Maya and Adam, for organizing this, and Dave for the introduction. Listening to the debate about the AMT, I was tempted to title my talk "Tax Policy in La La Land." The history is actually not quite as benign as Mr. Ryan made it out to be. It's actually the start of the AMT. It's just the beginning of one of many, many occasions where the Congress was not willing to face the real trade-offs it was faced with. In 1967, 155 high-income people didn't pay any income tax. The obvious thing for Congress to do were one of two choices. One is to say, well, they didn't pay any income tax because we created all of these tax incentives and they're doing good things, and get over it. That would have been hard because they were actually engaging in horrible tax sheltering activities, probably. The other thing would be to say, oh, whoops, we put all these tax shelters in the law and they don't make any sense, we'll get rid of them. But of course, the people who took advantage of the tax shelters also were big campaign contributors, so that wasn't a viable option. So they created this thing, an add-on tax, to make sure that high-income people didn't take advantage of things that Congress had put into the law so much that Congress would be embarrassed. It was terribly designed from the start. It got worse over time. It's never been adjusted for inflation. That's one reason why a lot of people get thrown onto the AMT every year. The regular income tax, if your income just keeps pace with inflation, your average tax rate stays the same from year to year. But under this alternative schedule, the parameters are carved in stone, except when Congress does their annual patches. And that means that without a change, the number of people on the AMT grows dramatically. Right now, the parameters are set at exactly the same level as they were in the year 2000. It doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it was designed. The AMT has horrible marriage penalties. One of the big things that gets you onto the AMT is having kids. You get to deduct them for the regular income tax, you don't deduct them for the AMT. I have 4 kids. This is just personal for me. The AMT, surprisingly, and people talk about it as this broad-based, low-rate tax. It's only got 2 official tax rates built in, 26% and 28%. But one of the great innovations in the AMT, which has also been used in the regular income tax in different ways, is that there are these phantom tax rates. And over a range of income, when your income goes up, you lose some of the AMT exemption. The way you calculate the AMT is you take your regular taxable income, you add back in deductions for your kids, state and local taxes, a bunch of other things, and then you get to subtract the AMT exemption amount. But to meet some kind of a budget target, that exemption was designed to phase out with income, starting at about $175,000 of AMTI, that's income under its alternate baseline, at a rate of 25%. So in that range of income, every dollar you earn increases your taxable income by $1.25. So that 26% rate becomes a rate of 32.5%. So that surtax applies to not only to regular income, it also applies to capital gains. Congress was so proud of lowering the tax rates on capital gains to 15%. But in that range of income, if you realize a capital gain increases your income by $1, you add 6.5% or even 7% to your capital gains rate. The consequence is that a lot of people in that phase-out range, between about $200,000 and $500,000 of income, face very high marginal rates under the AMT, much, much higher than they do under the regular income tax. And one of the bizarre and undesirable features of the AMT is that most people actually face higher marginal rates. That discourages working, saving, all of those things. And that gets to why some of the alternatives might not seem quite so bad when you compare them to what the AMT really is rather than the way it's advertised. The process of annually patching the AMT is just terrible policy. I mean, whatever you think the AMT should be or shouldn't be, waiting until 9 months or 12 months into the year before you decide what the AMT exemption level is going to be creates tremendous uncertainty. It doesn't raise any extra revenue for the government, but it means that people have to wonder what their tax situation is going to be. You have all of these tax breaks that are allowed under the regular income tax. They're not allowed under the AMT. And when you buy a hybrid car, right now, anybody on the AMT doesn't get the hybrid vehicle tax credit. And they won't know whether they're going to benefit from it until Congress decides what they're doing. That means that these subsidies, you can argue about whether the subsidy makes any sense at all, but it makes them less effective than they would be otherwise. I was going to talk about fiscal responsibility, but I guess the politicians did that. I agree with everything they said. How should you fix the AMT? The obvious thing to do would be to broaden the base. Tax reform would be an ideal time to get rid of the AMT. President Bush impaneled a tax reform panel which proposed to eliminate state and local tax deductions, a bunch of other things, and that paid for getting rid of the AMT, and rates would have been reduced at the same time. That's the perfect policy solution, but it's a non-starter politically, apparently. That report was forgotten 10 seconds after it was finished. Sorry about it. So you look for other alternatives that might make up the revenue, and it is important to do that. The surtax proposal that Mr. Rangel put forward is not perfect tax policy. You shouldn't have two different taxes, but it's it's really, really simple. If your income is above the AGI thresholds, you add 4% over a range of income and then 4.6% beyond that. There's been a lot of criticism that raises marginal rates. It does. But relative to the AMT, most people actually face lower marginal tax rates. Now, it does raise marginal tax rates significantly at the very, very top of the income distribution, but it makes the tax system more progressive overall, so that's a trade-off. It's transparent. It's something people would actually understand. Most people don't understand the AMT. 10 seconds for an anecdote, and I'll finish. The Consumer Reports, which usually gets things right, actually wrote something about the AMT, and they said, well, your mortgage interest deduction won't do you any good if you're on the AMT. It's not true, but so many people are completely confused about how the tax system works and how it affects them with the AMT that at a minimum it would be good to replace it with something that people could actually understand. It would certainly be a change.
Bob?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, David. When Maya sent out the email Monday evening, kind of giving us an indication of how this session would be organized and said we would have 5 minutes to talk about the AMT, I was horror-struck. How could one talk about the AMT in 5 minutes? And I think Glenn had that experience, and I probably have already used close to 1 minute just saying that. But one of the things I wanted to focus on is kind of the importance, the near term, the importance of getting an AMT patch passed. As everyone knows, the Bush administration has an AMT patch in this year's budget that was released in February. It's now early December. It's extremely important that a patch be enacted as soon as possible. One thing that I think everyone needs to recognize is that every day of delay means that taxpayers who would have gotten their refunds in February or March will now get them later. Currently, if an AMT patch were enacted and signed into law on let's say December 21st, then we would expect that some 16 million taxpayers, 16 to 17 million taxpayers would see their refunds delayed. And that's about $40 billion in refunds that will probably be pushed out several weeks at least. If the AMT patch is not passed at all, what we'll see rather than 4 million people being subject to the AMT today, we'll see 25 million people subject to the AMT next year. Very, very significant change in circumstances for individuals. I agree very much with the comments that others have made, in particular Len, that waiting until the end of the year to deal with the problem is particularly poor policy. And it would have been much better had this been dealt with much sooner. One of the things, as Len kind of alluded to, that taxpayers have to deal with as they pay their taxes throughout the year, particularly taxpayers in the income ranges that are caught by the AMT, they often make estimated tax payments. And many people who are caught by the AMT don't know about it. It's a surprise when they file their tax return in April. That will certainly be the case if you have 25 million people, in addition to 21 million people being caught by the AMT. And those people will may be subject to penalties estimated because they failed to make appropriate estimated tax penalties. Thinking more broadly about the AMT, not so much the near term, but in the longer run, it's an extremely significant problem in the tax code. It's a problem that we've had to deal with on a kind of an ad hoc basis every year with patches. Certainly through the Bush administration, virtually every year, every major tax bill, virtually every major tax bill has had some sort of provision dealing with the AMT in the near term. It's an extremely difficult issue. As Len kind of explained, the AMT is very much intertwined. It's a parallel tax system that runs parallel to the regular tax. It's very much intertwined with the regular tax in very intimate, intricate ways. And so if one wanted to really fundamentally address the AMT and come up with a long-term solution, one has to look at the regular tax as well. And in a very real sense, the AMT is a poster child for tax reform. And I think at some point over the next several years, perhaps we will get to tax reform as a nation, and the AMT will be dealt with in that context. One other point I wanted to make before I'm completely out of time is that although the AMT was enacted in 1969 to address the problem of 155 higher income taxpayers with incomes over, I think, $100,000 or $200,000 at the time, who paid virtually no tax, the AMT really did not become a significant problem in terms of affecting millions of taxpayers until the point in time when the regular tax was indexed in the early mid-1980s in 84, 85. When the regular tax was indexed and the AMT was not, there's the power of compounding in the passage of time. We're now in a situation where the AMT grows very rapidly, or will grow very rapidly relative to the regular tax. As I mentioned, 25 million people will be subject to the AMT next year if the patch is not passed. By the end of the 10-year budget window under the administration's policy baseline, 56 million people will be subject to the AMT. Steny Hoyer mentioned that it costs roughly $50 billion to address the AMT, pass an AMT patch this year. In 2012, it will be more than twice that. By the end of the 10-year budget window under the president's policy baseline, it will probably be in the order of $220 to $250 billion just the 1-year cost. So this is a ticking time bomb. It is a very significant problem and something that does need to be dealt with.
Thank you. Review. Pass the mic down. Can't reach down there. The monitor is supposed to be in the middle, so we can reach out and squeeze people.
Well, I want to try to do just two things, so hopefully I'm going to be okay. First, like Len, I want to add a little more background on some of where the AMT problem came from. And then I just want to try to make a little more concrete 2 principles for AMT reform that a number of people have tossed around this morning already: fiscal responsibility and fairness. As several panelists have mentioned, here we are in December and we still don't have the AMT patch that we all expect will probably be enacted. The reason we don't have an AMT patch, of course, is that we're caught in a standoff over whether the pay-as-you-go rules that have been applied to other legislation this year are going to apply to the AMT patch as well, or whether Congress should waive the pay-go rules for AMT and deficit finance the $51 billion patch. And I know that one of the reasons some people have offered for why it's a matter of principle that we shouldn't apply pay-go to AMT is this point that the AMT's growth was unintended, that this was an accidental problem. Now, Representative Hoyer talked about this, and he, I think, pointed out that there's an element of truth to this, which is no one intended the AMT to take the shape that it's projected to take this year under current law. 23 million people paying it, including a significant number of people with incomes under $100,000. But there is more to the story. And to see that there's more to the story, I think you have to see that the AMT problem itself has two parts. One is the problem that's already been talked about, which is that the AMT exemption was not indexed for inflation and has therefore been losing value in real terms and relative to the parameters of the individual income tax. And so you owe AMT when your AMT bill is higher than your individual income tax bill. We indexed the individual income tax, didn't index the AMT, more people on the AMT. But the second piece here, and it's of about equal magnitude, is the role of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts, where once again we made a large and permanent change to the individual income tax, lowering people's tax bills, but didn't make any equivalent change to the AMT. And so I think the Tax Policy Center has projected that had those tax cuts not been enacted, there would be 10 million people on the AMT this year as compared with 23 million. And in fact, about 2/3 of the cost of this year's patch is not due to that inflation problem, it's due to the effect of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. And so then the question of intention becomes a bit murkier. Because when policymakers were designing the 2001 tax bill, they were actually well aware of the AMT problem and were made well aware of the impact that the tax cut would have on the number of people owing the AMT. The Joint Committee on Taxation provided projections showing that by 2010 it would pretty much double the number of AMT taxpayers. But policymakers and designers of the tax bill were also aware of a fact about the way the Joint Committee scores tax legislation, which is that if they didn't change the AMT, the scoring would assume that the AMT would take back a lot of the tax cut, and so the tax cut would look a lot cheaper. And that meant you could pack more new tax cut provisions into your AMT bill and remain within your budget limit without breaking that budget limit and without it having to curb other tax cuts. And so the AMT was used really, I would say, as a budget gimmick to get that tax bill enacted. And so when we look at this year's AMT problem, we look at the fact that 2/3 of the cost of the patch is reflective of the cost of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. I think you can't really say that that whole problem was unintended and that the same pay-as-you-go rules that have been applied to other legislation Congress wants to enact really would apply here. So maybe I'll limit myself to one more point, which has to do with the sort of meaning of fiscal responsibility when we start talking about permanent AMT reform over the long run, and we talk about AMT repeal or about a permanent fix that would protect the middle class. And I think that to give meaning to that principle of fiscal responsibility is really to say that those changes should be paid for as well. And I thought Representative Ryan's comments were very interesting because I think this AMT issue has opened up the question of where should revenue levels be over the long run. And he made reference to this issue of the historical average level of revenues, which is something that a lot of people naturally look to as a benchmark. The problem is that given especially rising healthcare costs and given other pressures on the budget, we really face a choice: historical average levels of revenues or historical average levels of government services. You certainly can't have both. Maintaining the historical average level of revenues would mean curbing what government can do, especially in the public health programs, but also for the aging, for other vulnerable members of society, and for what many people consider needed new investments in education and other areas. And so I'll stop, and I think I'll be within my time.
Good.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Maya, for putting this together today. One thing I've learned is 5 minutes goes real fast. So, although 5 for us is, from the audience perspective, is more like an hour. So, I want to make a couple of points. Many have been made already. In fact, there's really been a lot said, a lot of good information that's out on the AMT. and it's hard to say something creative. I actually blame Len because he's really the guru and has written the most, I think, about this issue. So I'll try to carve out a couple of short points. One, I just want to talk about the distribution of the AMT from a geographic perspective. In simplest terms, we know the AMT is a tax that tends to hit folks in the upper middle class, and if we don't patch it, it's going to hit more and more taxpayers earning in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. But there's also, if we dig a little deeper, we learned that there's two factors, and Len mentioned them already, that drive people onto the AMT. It's issues that lower your ordinary tax, and the two largest ones are paying lots of state and local tax, and the other one is having lots of children. Well, I think that the distribution of family size is probably pretty consistent across the country, maybe with the exception of Utah and Florida being the tails. But the distribution of the state and local taxes vary considerably across the country. And as a result, the places that AMT is a big issue varies a lot. And I'll run off a couple of quick statistics. This is for data from 2005. The AMT was patched in 2005, so obviously this is sort of gives you an idea of the magnitude of the issue, assuming it's patched. 1 in 11 taxpayers in New Jersey paid the AMT. 1 in 12 in New York, and 1 in 13 in Connecticut. Pretty significant numbers of taxpayers in those states. Conversely, in Alabama, 1 out of 60 taxpayers. In Tennessee, 1 out of 70 taxpayers. And in South Dakota and Alaska, only 1 out of 80 taxpayers were hit with the AMT. The distribution I think, is striking in that regard. I'm certainly not the first to say that this is a blue state issue, and I think that to some extent these statistics support that. Of the 6 states where AMT is the biggest issue, that's New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, California, Massachusetts, and Maryland. In those 6 states, all 12 senators are Democrats. Looking at the House representing those states, 71% of the representatives are Democrats versus roughly 54% in the House as a whole. So it's actually perhaps impressive that there's such a bipartisan interest in doing something about the AMT, and as Steny Hoyer emphasized a number of times, the question is how, not what. The second point I want to make is related to a point that Paul Ryan made on the budget and goes to the pay-go issues that Aviva was mentioning. I think that the AMT is really a good illustration of what we need when we think about setting our budget policies and our tax revenue objectives. Paul Ryan argued for revenues being at their historical level. I think that there's a good argument to make that perhaps revenues should be higher given changing demographics, rising healthcare costs. I think there are good arguments to make that they should be lower given the evidence that smaller governments lead to faster growing economies. What I think is difficult to argue is that the revenue baseline should be what it is today for today and what it's programmed to be tomorrow for tomorrow. So today it's projected to be about 18.8% of GDP. In 2012 it's projected to be just over 20% of GDP. I don't know, we can argue about which number is the right number, but to say that every year it should be the level that would concur with a do-nothing set of policies, I don't think is likely to be the best choice. The third point I want to make is just to offer, and this will be my final point, is just sort of make a comment about how one might create a hodgepodge solution. Certainly not the best solution to the AMT, but one way that Congress could consider a permanent approach to dealing with the AMT, and Len mentioned this himself, is to broaden the ordinary tax base. And there are a variety of ways to do this, but one of them would be to limit the ability of a taxpayer to deduct their state and local deductions. The revenue raised from limiting your state and local deductions to 2% of your AGI is roughly the cost of indexing the AMT for inflation over time. So that type of approach would raise revenue from in the states where AMT is the biggest issue, and wouldn't lead us to have a tax increase that affects Alabama, Alaska, and South Dakota to the extent while allowing tax relief in Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Congressman Frenzel?
Thank you very much. I am Bill, and I do pay alternate minimum tax. When I bought my hybrid 4 years ago, I got screwed out of my tax credit. So I harbor no love for that animal. I do want to talk a little bit about history, first of all. When the list of 155 Americans or American families were published, the name that led all the rest was Mrs. Horace Dodge, who was, her entire income consisted of interest on tax-exempt municipal bonds. And so the first attack on these 155 families was an attempt in the Ways and Means Committee during the reign of Wilbur Mills to get rid of the tax-exempt feature on municipal bonds. The day the bill was passed, the municipal bond market tanked, and everyone went crazy in New York and Washington. Russell Long saved the day by making the announcement that Senate was going to take care of that, don't worry, and so the bond market got put back together again. But the attempt to attack these high earners who were not paying taxes fell on its nose because Congress did not desire to go ahead. They had to choose between a ruined bond market and a way to get money from people who weren't paying taxes, and they chose to punt. They wanted both of them, and that's what they got. We didn't fuss with it much again until 1987, and it got the whimsicalities of it and the goofiness of it were simply increased in the Tax Reform Act of 1987, when of course the Congress was shopping for money to lower individual and corporate rates. Next item of history is the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, where the pay-go system becomes a part of law. That later, I think, to the shame of my party, is allowed to expire in 2004. And again, to the credit, I think, of Democrats, they are trying to hold it now. And this is one of the big shootouts. When I served on the President's advisory panel on tax reform, where Bob Carroll and his friends did all our scoring work, I believe that the cost to do that over 10 years to get rid of the AMT was $1 trillion, trillion and a half, something like that.
1.5.
Yeah, and nevertheless, that group, bipartisan group, believed that there was nothing worse in the tax code, and that was priority number one on the elimination list, and so we got rid of it. And so it should be gotten rid of again. On the other hand, I got to come down with Hoyer. I believe that pay-go needs to be maintained. I will admit the budget system and the budget baselines are goofy and they need to be improved. Nevertheless, they're the only rule we have is that pay-go rule, and if we do not cling to it, then I think we've lost all vestige of control. Congress will always have the problem of wanting to take care of all the interests in sight and eventually wind up taking care of none of them, particularly worrying about our fiscal situation. Paul Ryan has suggested a trade-off for tax reform, allowing you to give up all of your tax preferences and choosing a lower rate per his bill, or stay with the old system. Keep all your gimmicks and pay at the old higher rate. It's an interesting choice, because one of the things that happened to us on the tax reform panel was that the day after, within 24 hours after we released our announcement that we were going to make changes in the homeowner's tax preference, the Association of Realtors, Mortgage Bankers, and all the other people in the mortgage business, whose reputation was much better then than it is now, were able to make a press release saying that they had a majority of votes in the House and the Senate against us, and therefore our report was dead. That gives a little more impetus to Paul's choice of giving the taxpayer a choice. Maybe a gimmick. On the other hand, it may be a passable gimmick. But in the meantime, I would dearly love to get rid of the AMT, but I think that it should not be done at the cost of sacrificing paygo.
Thank you very much. Let me ask a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. I think that I'm going to propose that we don't have to, nobody has to defend the AMT as a great system. We can sort of agree on that. I think we can all agree that there's going to be a patch this year. I understand why Bob Carroll and the IRS can't print the forms until Congress passes the law, but I think we can, let's assume it's going to get done, and we're not going to have to worry about all these people thrown on. And I want to do two things. One is, it seems to me that you can talk about the details of the AMT, which gets pretty thick pretty fast, and it's a good thing that we have, Quicken and TurboTax. Or you can look at it as a sort of a symptom of something else. And I want to pose one question on the symptom and one question on Paul Ryan, and then turn it out. We'll have to be sort of disciplined with the mic so that C-SPAN can hear this. So what is the AMT is a symptom of these kind of horse trading that goes on in tax bills and ends up with something that inevitably the tax policy experts say is really ugly. And so tax policy experts tend to have conversations that begin, well, suppose we're starting all over again for the tax code, how do we make it work? Which time do they stop listening, because we're not going to start from scratch. So we had this interesting tax reform panel. It's not the first one. What has to happen before the conversation goes beyond this year's Band-Aid and next year's Band-Aid, or this year's argument about pay-go, to getting to a broader fix that puts the tax code on a more rational basis? What's the political strategy or future that allows us to get to that point? Ryan, do you want to take it, Brad?
The answer, of course, is that it's going to be hard, but I agree with Maya that the expiration of the Bush tax cuts at the end of 2010 and the AMT problem that nobody can figure out how to solve really on an incremental basis could create an impetus for tax reform maybe in 2009. I came to Washington to work on what became the Tax Reform Act of 1986, and the thing that happened in 1986 was that there was strong presidential leadership. The president did not put a lot of conditions on what tax reform would be. He said it would be revenue neutral, distributionally neutral, and he wanted to cut marginal rates, and basically everything else was on the table. And he worked in a bipartisan way. Actually, his main allies in Congress to begin with were the Democrats in the House and the Republicans in the Senate. And somehow you need to get at some kind of, there needs to be a bipartisan process. It would always be simple for people on the other side to pick off pieces of any tax reform plan and attack who's ever advocating it. When the tax reform panel made their proposal, they said you have to look at this as a whole. Don't look at each of the individual provisions, because some people pay higher taxes when you move to a system that's more rational. The other thing is that you really do need to make the argument in terms of doing something for our kids and our grandkids. I agree with Congressman Hoyer when he said that tax reform would not be painless, but Republicans and Democrats alike really do care about their kids and their grandchildren, and current policies are just on a disastrous course.
Does anybody else have a, Bob, do you want to try? Why do you think that the tax reform report didn't go very far? I guess you could say no contest or something and pass the mic.
I'll just say one of the dilemmas that the tax reform panel had, as Bill Frenzel indicated, two dilemmas. One dilemma was they decided to pay for AMT repeal, and that affected the fabric of their proposals in a very, very dramatic way, because they decided to do their work under the administration's policy baseline. So with that as a starting point, the cost of replacing the AMT was at the time 1.5 trillion. Today it would be 1.6 under the president's policy baseline, not the 6, 7, or 800 billion under the current law baseline. So that made a big difference. And the other problem I think that the tax panel report, or the effort had, is that it was a revenue neutral reform. With any revenue neutral reform, there are winners and losers. And Paul Ryan talks about the tax expenditure lobby, and that's, Bill Frenzel talked about the position of the realtors. And any revenue neutral reform, that's a very big political issue that needs to be dealt with. So you need enough political energy to in a sense offset the winners and losers that will result from any revenue neutral reform.
Congressman?
Yeah, I think the clue to why the tax panel didn't work is because I was on it. After I had screwed up the Social Security Commission report, they assigned me to the tax panel, and I wrecked that as well. One of the problems, when we went into the tax reform in 1986, with President Reagan leading the charge, the polls showed very high that there was a great approval for tax reform, and that we needed to get something done. And of course, one of the reasons for that was that there was no plan out there, and so everyone could be for their own plan of tax reform. When the President's Advisory Panel was put together, the same kind of polls were showing results 2/3 lower. Nobody gave a damn. By that time, they decided they were going to get hosed by nearly any tax plan that the government put together, and so nobody had a lot of faith that it would go. Last point is one that Leader Hoyer made, and that is, at the time you had a very strong leadership from the President and leadership in the Congress as well. So when you have Ronald Reagan and Dick Gebhardt and Dan Rostenkowski and Bill Bradley and a few Republicans like Bob Pack was thrown in, made a very good mix. That's what's going to happen, and I think it was Len mentioned the due date of 2010. Maybe that combination can be recreated in some way.
Now, Congressman Ryan's proposal allows turns the tax code into a kind of one of those Chinese buffets. You can decide whether you want to get the hot buffet or the cold buffet. Len wanted to say something about that, and I want to give everybody else a chance if they want to say something about it, and then we'll turn to the audience. We can keep it short, Len, so we can get some questions in.
Yeah, I was actually, I thought Congressman Ryan was going to tell us what he was going to do about entitlements. I was really excited. There are two problems. One, of course, is that, tax reform really does involve making choices, and this would be one where to say, well, this is our alternative, but if you would pay higher taxes, then you don't have to pay it. The big problem is that the math isn't right. Whoever did the numbers on the Taxpayer Choice Act just didn't get it right. It would actually increase the deficit by something like $5 or $6 trillion over the next decade. It was not even revenue neutral relative to the president's baseline with the AMT repealed. So, I mean, the problem is, it's kind of obvious. If you give people a choice, they're going to take the one where they pay lower taxes. And there are a lot of people that don't benefit from this. Low-income people would lose all the refundable credits. Anybody who gets a foreign tax credit is likely to be better off under the old system because foreign tax credit would be abandoned. And of course, you couldn't just make this the new system and have foreign tax credit repealed because you'd be immediately abrogating all of our tax treaties.
Okay. I guess we should try and keep the questions on the AMT, but we've raised some questions about the level of taxes, the distribution of taxes, and fiscal responsibility, so they're fair game too. I think what you should do is stand up if you have a question, raise your hand, say it, and then I'll repeat it for the mic, since we don't have a traveling mic. Otherwise, I'll keep asking questions. Anybody have a question? Sir.
One panelist has presented that this is a blue state, red state issue. It's very much factionalized. Why isn't it in the campaign to a greater degree? Why aren't we seeing this discussed?
The question is, given that it's a blue state, red state thing, why isn't this more of a factor in the presidential campaign? Does anybody?
I'm talking a lot, but I guess I've thought a lot about the AMT. The problem really is that most people don't really know it's coming. People in this room, this is really an extraordinary group who pays attention. There are only 4 million people on the AMT in 2006. And actually, if you wanted to raise consciousness about the AMT, the best thing you could do would be to not let the patch be enacted. And then 23 million people would be subject to it, and all of a sudden there would be better public consciousness.
Some people say that oh, please go.
It is also true that the AMT is, it's a pain in the neck, and to certain people it's very expensive. And as Alex pointed out, it hits a certain number of states, which happen to be states that have high income taxes and high real property taxes. And that's the way most people get caught up in this thing. It's 28%, the top rate is 35%. The people who pay it now are pretty comfortable. They probably haven't got any idea, you know, they sign the report, somebody else makes it for them. They're doing okay. And so I don't think you're hearing a lot of pain. But when 25 million more people come on, you will hear a lot of screaming.
I think that's why we're going to get a patch out.
On this point of who's paying and how's paying, I think Bill's absolutely right. I think the numbers are that the average person who gets caught for about $1,000. Is that right?
Yes.
2001. It's not a huge, dramatic change in one's tax liability.
4,000. It would be 2,000 if the 23 million. It's an average of $4,000.
Okay. For those who paid last year.
So what Len said was last year the average taxpayer who paid the AMT paid about $4,000. If it were allowed to hit another 23 million people, then the average would go down to 2,000. But it's the order of magnitude. The point that I want to make, though, is the number of people who are potentially affected. I mean, so in other words, the number of people, and this is a point that was made in another way earlier, the number of people who have to think about it is really in the tens of millions. Regardless of, so if it's patched, tens of millions of people are going to have to think about it, going to have to ask the question, do I have to pay? And the answer will be no. If it's not patched, the same number of people, roughly, are going to have to ask the question, do I have to pay? And the answer is going to be yes. There's a very large burden, regardless of whether or not it's patched. It's an administrative burden. It has to do with the uncertainty. Because people don't sit down every day and calculate their tax liability. They calculate it at the end of the year. They may calculate it, they may estimate it throughout the year. But that uncertainty, simply by the existence of the AMT, is putting a significant number of taxpayers at risk, regardless of what the final outcome might be come April 15th. And that's why, even if you were to find a solution that's a permanent solution that keeps the AMT, it's also going to keep the uncertainty for a number of taxpayers much larger than the number of people who actually have to pay it, sort of on the edge. Sorry, another question?
Oh,
Sir? I'm
I
sorry.
would jump in with just a very quick point, taking issue a little bit with this blue state, red state premise. And I think it has to do with the same distinction between the people who paid the AMT in 2005 or 6 with a patch in place, and this universe of people who could potentially be affected. I think the blue state, red state distinction becomes less clear there. Len, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your estimates show that basically every married couple with kids over pretty wide income ranges would be on the AMT, which means you're talking about people across the nation.
Sir?
Question for Bob Carroll. You mentioned the problem of first-time AMT payers getting stuck with penalties. not realizing that they should have been paying in the system before. Couldn't the IRS deal with that administratively, just simply waiving the penalties through their first time?
Let me repeat the question. So the question is, if you get stuck with AMT for the first time and you weren't aware, you're subject to a penalty for not having set aside enough money for taxes during the year. That was an allegation. I'm not sure. Is that true?
Yeah, so basically taxpayers are required to some taxpayers are required to make estimated tax payments to make sure that they're paying kind of tax on an accrual basis throughout the year. The problem with the AMT is for many taxpayers, particularly if the patch is not, is not enacted, not passed, you'll have the 24 million, you'll have 21 million people who will be hit by the AMT without perhaps anticipating it. They might not have made the estimated tax payments that they would have been required to make with the higher overall tax liability associated with the AMT. Our hope is certainly that and I think hopefully the expectation is, that David's expectation at least, is that the AMT patch will be enacted, and this won't hopefully be an issue.
But if it were, couldn't the IRS at least get that part out of the way by waiving the penalties?
Yeah, that's not something I could comment on.
I'm not entirely sure that that's an administrative thing, not a legal thing. I don't know. Is there another sir in the back?
Well, some of this stuff can be solved by choices. If you are concerned about the dependent exemption, stop supporting your kids. If you're concerned about the marriage tax aspect, get a divorce. And if you're concerned about the tax on the tax of state and local governments, move to Florida. This can be solved by individual choice.
The gentleman
Yeah,
makes
you
a
also
statement.
need to rent a house so you're not paying real estate.
The gentleman makes a statement on a question saying that you can avoid the AMT if you don't support your kids, move to a low tax state, and don't own a house.
You get a divorce.
Did you have a question here? Yeah.
I do. I was actually just hoping that the panelists could talk a little bit about who's going to be hit by the AMT next year, because I know that far out you're getting into real people that we would all think of as middle class. But I'm wondering about how much of the cost of next year's patch is really going to people we'd all see as middle income people, and how much of it is going to upper middle income and even upper income people.
So the question is, who would get hit if they don't do a patch, or who would they get hit if they
Who would get hit if they don't get a patch?
Right, the question is, who would get hit if they don't do a patch? My only caution here is that my rule in Washington about the definition of middle income is it's always whatever the person who's speaking makes. That's always the ceiling on middle income. I'm sure every single member of Congress considers him or herself middle income, including Herb Kohl.
So one way to think about it is what is you take a typical family of four and you calculate when would they go onto the AMT, when would they begin paying alternative minimum tax without a patch. I believe that number is around 67, 68,000.
It's true that a lot of middle income families defined as like between $75,000 and $100,000 of income will be subject to the tax. It's something like 36%, more than a third, would be subject to the tax in 2007. Families with kids, especially very large families, would be hit by the tax. It wouldn't necessarily be a lot, but we have an example I developed for some testimony I did a few months ago. It was the Brady Bunch. It's a family with 6 kids earning, I think, $75,000 taking the standard deduction, and they're subject to they would be subject to the AMT this year without a patch. And they're not doing anything to as a tax shelter, and it's not a lot. It would actually just double their tax from $2,000 to $4,000. But if you're actually earning $75,000 and trying to support 6 kids, that would be a problem. That said, the distribution of the benefits from the patch disproportionately go to the top 20% of the income distribution, but it doesn't go to the very, very top. One of the bizarre things about the AMT is you're actually more likely to be subject to the AMT if you're making $75,000 to $100,000 than if you're making over $1 million.
Because over $1 million, your marginal tax rate is so high, it's already higher than you would pay if you were taxed at the.
And also because you're out of that phase-out range where you have the high AMT rates.
Right.
And that's a very important conceptual point. You could think of the AMT as almost a bubble, that as the value of the AMT exemption is eroded, this bubble kind of moves down the income distribution. So today, it's really concentrated on people who have incomes probably in the order of $200,000 to $500,000. Without the AMT patch, this bubble moves down. And so you have people with higher incomes moving off the AMT because their regular tax is in effect going up relative to their AMT. So roughly about, for very high income people, roughly about 25% of people remain on the AMT. But without the patch, this bubble kind of moves down to probably the $75,000 to $300,000 income group.
Can I ask a question about the complexity thing? So sometimes people say the tax code is complex, and they use it as an argument for doing away with something they don't like. For instance, I've never been believed that having 10 brackets is really a whole lot more complex than having 3. So, but it is true that because of the AMT, it's very hard for a lot of people to say, if my wife or I is thinking of taking an extra part-time job, what's our after-tax going to be? It's hard to fill out your W-2 because you can't just look at the tax table and say, well, we're in the 25% bracket, so a quarter, so forth. So my question is, do we really think that makes a difference? Does it affect people's economic decision making other than just being a hassle that there's a whole set of people that don't know what their tax is? Or alternatively, are they so ignorant that they think they're going to pay it to 25%?
It's true that with, Bill made the point that with tax software with an accountant, somebody else figures your tax for you anyway, and maybe it's not a big deal, but, Congress goes to all this trouble to create all of these incentives to do something or another, the hybrid vehicle credit, and because of the AMT, you don't know whether you're going to benefit from that or not. Most people who are on the AMT really can't tell what their marginal rate is, and maybe there's actually an economic literature on the optimality of random taxation, and maybe this is just a brilliant ploy to make sure that people can't do optimal tax avoidance because they have no idea what they're avoiding. But in my view, maybe it's just old-fashioned, is that people actually ought to understand how the tax system is affecting them, and the AMT makes it almost impossible.
Is there another question in the back?
I want to return to the benefit side for a minute. I thought like the Citizens for Tax Justice report showed that maybe the top 10, 20% income distribution, the biggest earners are getting a lion's share, maybe 2/3 of the benefits. And that only would go...
The benefits of what?
The benefits of an AMT patch. And that would exclude, as Len pointed out, maybe the top 2% of the earners. And that kicks in maybe at 121,000 or so. If you go look at the top 7%, excluding the top 2%, maybe the 93rd to the 97th percentile, you're looking at an extraordinary percentage, disproportionate amount of the benefits. So I'm hoping for a comment on that. And then more broadly, conversations like these, I think, are always benefit from a discussion or just a reference to what the actual income distribution is. Herd polls, annual income aside, it's important for people to really get an idea of what the median income is for, say, a family of 4 and roughly what the distribution is. And I think this audience and perhaps the C-SPAN audience would help as well.
Right, so I think there were 2 questions. One is the assertion that the benefits of the patch would actually go to very well-off people, which I guess you have to make an assumption about how you pay for it. Obviously, if you pay for it by raising taxes on the rich, they would do it. And the second was a good question about what is the median income and what's the distribution like. So, Mr. Numbers, can you answer those 2 numbers questions?
I've got some estimates on how it affects what a patch looks like as a share of income in 2007, and it's about 0.2% of income for the 4th quintile, people between the 60th and 80th percentiles, 0.9%, a little bit less than 1% of the income for people in the next 10% group. And the groups that get the biggest benefit are the 90th to 95th percentiles, which get 1.3% of their income in tax cuts, and 95 to 99%, which would get a tax cut worth 1.8%. In the very top 1%, the patch is worth about 1/10 of 1% of income. So enacting a patch by sort of traditional measures would be a very regressive tax cut. Virtually all the benefits go to high income people, but hardly any of them go to people at the very, very top.
Okay. And what's the median income when you do what is a family of 4 or Bob, what's the median income?
I think it's around 70,000.
70,000
Median
family
income
of
for
four.
a family of four is about, my recollection is about 70,000. And I guess the way I would respond is if you think of this bubble going through the income distribution, and you have this bubble of AMT taxpayers, if you enact a patch, most of the benefits are going to people who are in that bubble. So if you have a kind of a smaller fraction of very high income people who are subject to the AMT in the first place, roughly 25%, most of the benefits are not going to go to that very high income group. Instead, the benefits are going to go to the folks who you're probably in the 75 to $300,000 or $400,000 range.
Right. So if you're in
and I would just point out that many of those taxpayers may well be in the top 10%.
Right. But it's true that if you wanted to cut taxes on the bottom third of Americans, the AMT patch would not be your chosen gift.
Bottom third of Americans
Don't pay anything. But if you wanted to, one might argue that it would be more important to use this money to reduce the payroll tax. It is not, as Lynn said, it is not a way to help the people at the bottom. It's a way to stop something from hitting people who are somewhere in the middle enough. So I'm not going to
really in the middle. We're talking about 90th percentile or the 85th percentile. Those people, that's not the middle. The people in the middle are basically off the tax rolls.
Right.
From an income tax perspective.
Aviva?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple points there. Len gave those figures in terms of percent of after-tax income, which is the right way to look at it if you want to look at what it's doing to the income distribution. But if you're thinking about spending $51 billion, you might also just want to know where the dollars are going and to what groups. So about a third of the value of the patch is going to people in the $200,000 to $500,000 income range, which is about 3% of households. But half the benefits of the patch are going to the $100,000 to $200,000 income range, which is about 11% of households. And even though the bubble that Bob Carroll is talking about of people has been moving down such that it really is reaching down below 100,000, the money bubble is still staying pretty far up there. And only 14% of the total value of that $51 billion patch is going to those households between $50,000 and $100,000. Essentially none is going below $50,000. With respect quickly to this issue of who pays taxes, it's true that the income tax threshold for a family of four is at about $40,000. So below that family, that married couple with kids, is probably not on the income tax. They are paying payroll taxes. And they can be reached through the income tax system by the Earned Income Tax Credit or the Refundable Child Tax Credit. And in fact, one of the interesting features of the Rangel permanent AMT proposal is that it would couple AMT repeal, which doesn't reach anybody really in the bottom, half of the income spectrum, with expansions of the standard deduction, the Refundable Child Tax Credit, and the Earned Income Tax Credit, which would reach that broader population.
Okay, I think we're going to let Aviva have the last word. I want to thank everybody for all of you who hung in here for an hour and a half to talk about the AMT. Get a life. Thank you very much.